Hi, this is Michael Brooks, back here with you. I'm a writer and blogger. You can check out my work at www.theelusiveobvious.com. And I'm about to interview my friend, David Pakman. So great to be with you, David.
It's great. Great studio.
Yeah, this is an amazing place. I'm honored to have the privilege to be here. So you heard my kind of opening spiel, and I have to ask you first of all, any interest in buying a Rockaware Occupy All Streets T-shirt?
No, it's not really my thing.
Okay, all right, yeah, I think definitely Jay-Z miscalculated, but I want to get to the kind of second part of this, which is I do think that there's a kind of shift in the moral tenor around these debates, around the Occupy movement, because of the just sort of, I think you just say very objectively, police overreaction or overreaction of whoever was kind of, commanding the police in these situations. I think that seems pretty obvious. But in terms of Democrats getting more kind of aligned with the movement, do you still think that there's a real danger there in terms of how the public perceives the movement in spite of these recent events?
Well, I think that you made a really good point, which is that Democrats want to be associated with all of the positives of the movement and want to reap the benefits of the positives as much as possible when it comes to elections, without really going out on any kind of limb and saying the right side is the side of the protesters, kind of in a more objective way. There's a lot of equivocating, which is kind of to be expected with national level politicians particularly.
Sure.
So yeah, I think people need to be aware that there's a lot of political manipulation going on here. There's also other types of political manipulation. I mean, Michael Bloomberg, the mayor of New York City, started taking heat over I'd say the last 7 to 10 days has been the heaviest part, because of the going into Zuccotti Park in the middle of the night and essentially evicting people in a way that some argue is actually not representative of free speech, etc. And just the other day, just last night, I was watching, I was at the gym and I've got CNN on and they have different news channels on, and there's going to be a Michael Bloomberg press conference.
Right.
And it's going to be related to terror. And right away, I said, this to me seems like a strategy to distract from all of the criticisms of Michael Bloomberg. And after seeing the press conference where he said that there was a apparent lone wolf who had been tracked for years actually by a criminal informant that was working with authorities, so they knew that this guy was not a real danger, they were watching him, that he had been arrested. And I said to myself, isn't this happening all the time? Is this really worthy of a news conference? And it really seems to me like it's political posturing around Occupy Wall Street.
Right, right. I actually saw reported today that the FBI declined to participate in this case because of how low value it was considered.
Incredible, yeah.
So that really supports what you're saying. So do you think, though, that that Occupy, as far as I can tell, obviously it's a very diverse movement. There's a lot of different people there, and there's a very loose premise to it, which I think has really worked to its advantage from a kind of organizational perspective. But it seems to me that, and Andrew Sullivan actually acknowledged this in a column he wrote, and he tends to be a more center-right kind of guy. He said that he sees Occupy Wall Street as basically a protest for rebalancing, that things have gotten so extreme in one direction in terms of deregulation, in terms of kind of financial speculation, that it's basically a movement to say, let's restore some kind of balance to the system and open up more opportunity. And do you think that there's a way of adopting some strategy around that language that can really embed Occupy as a totally mainstream force and a kind of force to be reckoned with?
I think if there was that kind of idea going in, it might have been more of a reasonable possibility to do that in a real way. My concern is now, there are some things that have come out generally from Occupy that have been, I think, positive and clear results of Occupy Wall Street. So, for example, the fact that Republican Eric Cantor a couple of weeks ago referred to income disparity not in a way that's making fun of hippies, right, but in a way that it's an actual issue. The way he wanted to resolve it, I didn't agree with, but he mentioned it as a real issue. Income disparity is a problem for people, not just for liberals, not just for hipsters at Zuccotti Park, but for people in this country. That, to me, is a direct result of Occupy Wall Street, and that's fantastic. However, given that we have that and a couple of other, the banks and Wall Street are really the problem, and a couple of other main narratives, and there are over 20 different things that have been presented as issues, I don't know if it's going to be really possible to kind of mainstreamize the idea of rebalancing for fairness or something like that, if it's possible at this point. However, if there's a really good kind of PR campaign, that the thing is, I think what would be required to do that is something that would be against what the movement stands for, which is some kind of cohesive organization and maybe actually some experts in publicity getting involved.
Right. So you think that it's a tricky thing. So you think that professionalizing it would probably maybe give it a kind of greater chance of the type of success we're talking about. But yet at the same time, the, professional left or whatever you want to call it has, politely really struggled for the past couple of decades. And in a sense, this, movement has probably done more to get those issues on the front burner and kind of reframe the national discussion than any other kind of traditional liberal advocacy group.
I agree. I think it's a catch-22 because I think at this point, we can go back and say if from the beginning A, B, and C were done, that's fine. That's kind of a Monday morning quarterbacking type of thing, even though it's still Sunday proverbially, right? I mean, we're still in the game. However, given where we are now, I think the question is how can it go forward? And, I think that police departments, like what happened at UC Davis, are not doing the movement that wants these people to go get jobs, as we heard from many Republican politicians, and get off the street. They're not doing that movement any service, I think. I think that the movement is actually helped by that because, I mean, when you see the video of the pepper spraying at point blank range of 20 people, it's almost a parody. I mean, you couldn't parody bizarre police action any better than just pepper spraying people in the face who are clearly just sitting there, you know? So I think that's actually doing the most to help the movement, maybe more than any publicist could really do.
Right. And it's interesting. You mentioned the kind of Republican sort of get a job. And I know, Newt Gingrich said the other day, he said, take a bath and get a job. And I thought to myself, this isn't my career goal, but I think, plenty of people would probably be if they could get jobs to sort of influence, peddle Congress and run, kind of consultancy pyramid schemes like he does and basically get paid a lot of money to go around and talk and declare things. They probably would.
Sure. And, it wouldn't even be, that sounds like a pretty cushy job.
Yeah.
I think a lot of those people, what's being completely missed is that a lot of those people would take much lower paying jobs than that too. They just can't get them. Right. So it's not that they're there because they're just turning down the 6-figure, banking job or whatever else. Or right. I mean, they're there. One of the reasons they're there is because of the jobs problem.
It's like why are you bagging groceries? You could have gone to Yale. Like, what's the matter with you?
Exactly.
Yeah. I mean, and I think related to that, what I'm curious to hear from you is, when you look at these Republican debates and you look at comments like that, which just even strategically don't make sense, because I think, unemployment, underemployment is affecting everybody across the board, from, recent graduates, like everybody has a kind of sense of it. And you look at a party that's sort of setting aside any specific policy views, they almost seem like, with the exception of, maybe Huntsman, kind of just disavowing empathy, basically, as a trait. Do you think there's long-term dangers in that for them?
I actually disagree that it's strategically incorrect for Newt Gingrich to say,
maybe not
take
for
a bath and get a job. Sure. Because the primary voters are known to really vote for kind of the red meat Republican ideals, which don't benefit them personally, right? It's a very long tradition of Republican primary voters voting against their own best interest. I mean, Joe the plumber, who wasn't really a plumber, was one of the perfect examples of that, right? So actually, I don't know that strategically it doesn't make sense. I think maybe it does make sense because actually, I think even if you asked unemployed Republican primary voters, they see themselves as very, very different than a lot of those protesters. Even though they both don't have a job, and presumably they would both like a job, they still see themselves very, very differently. So maybe it's actually smart what Newt Gingrich is doing. I don't know.
Yeah, I want to follow up on that question, but first I remember a couple of years ago in the New York Times, they profiled people who founded Tea Parties, and I forget the guy's name, but they said, he got laid off from, some middle management job, and the first thing he did was he went online, he applied for unemployment benefits and made sure he got all of his government benefits in line, and then he opened up a Tea Party, Obama's a communist website. So I think you're completely right.
Sure.
But looking at the more kind of strategic long term, when you're not just dealing with, Republican primary voters and, God knows what's motivating them, in a kind of longer horizon of not just saying, because it seemed like in 2010, there was I think from a policies perspective, it was ridiculous and erroneous. But there was Obama's failed. We want to get people back to work. Here's why. And obviously that had some pull. But heading into this election, it's like, yeah, what employment crisis? There's a, lazy slobs crisis. How does that play in a kind of broader electorate? And, what do you make of that beyond the primary?
Well, I think people are waking up. It's taking a little, it's not happening overnight, but people are waking up. So if you were to tell me the scenario right now is that the only places people can get news are the 3-letter corporate media outlets that we're very familiar with, and the narrative is one where it's just either you believe this kind of Republican narrative about Occupy, about jobs, about healthcare, et cetera, or there's just really nothing else, and nobody's really get organizing about anything else. I would say, you know what, it's not going to change, and that strategy is going to be a winning one for Republicans. However, I think with the rise of more and more independent media outlets and alternative views, with Occupy Wall Street, with even though there's so much wrong with the healthcare reform bill, health insurance reform bill that was passed by the Obama White House, it still is something that I think woke people up that you can make changes, even if they are kind of Ted Kennedy type incremental changes.
Sure.
I think that Republicans need to use this strategy as fast as possible to get back in power before people continue waking up. Because if you look at the emails I was getting when we started the show years ago, and you just track the tenor and the tone of them over time, I understand that it's a skewed, we get emails from both sides and most people are progressive, but people are much more aware of the movements that are taking place and of how change could actually happen. I mean, 4 years ago, who knew about corporate personhood and moving to amend, right? I mean, that was not really in the narrative. So many people know about these things now.
Right.
So I think Republicans need to act as quickly as they can before people realize that what they're being sold is not good.
So get out there quick, Republicans. Those lazy bastards. Say it as much and as loudly as possible before the window closes.
Yeah,
okay,
I think
really
that's true. I hope. I mean, I'm normally very cynical and pessimistic, but I really do see optimism in that particular way.
Right. I want to follow up on that actually, because I think about the sort of younger demographic, folks like you and I guess me to a certain extent, people who are kind of, maybe starting their own businesses, freelancing, doing consulting, this kind of new economy, which is actually extremely entrepreneurial, extremely independently driven, and often with very, very progressive politics. So is there an opportunity going into the future for Democrats and progressive forces to frame, reinvigorated social spending and opportunity creation in a kind of, maybe you wouldn't want to mention Scandinavian countries, but similar to Scandinavian countries where this social infrastructure actually really supports entrepreneurship. And there's an opportunity for people to benefit from the independence and the opportunities and of risk-taking that are associated with that without feeling like, there's interesting projects and risk-taking and then, absolutely no floor under you versus the kind of traditional debate between Republicans and Democrats, which is, social spending for, people to sort of sit around and do nothing, which is the Republican frame, or Democratic frame, which is, social spending for people who absolutely need it and need to be protected, which of course I would tend to agree with. But getting into this whole other realm of opportunity creation and things like that as a way to frame that spending.
Well, I think, it's almost, my audience would almost be bored if I go back into how successful Republicans have been at framing and wordsmithing in general, right? I mean, we've got the examples of Thomas Frank, including tax relief. Taxes are bad, and therefore lower taxes are relieving you. Relief is good, right? That's one framing. Pro-life as something that is actually sometimes very anti-life. Pro-life, so therefore, if you believe women should have the right to an abortion, well, by definition, you must be anti-life, right? So that narrative, we know about that level of framing.
Frank Luntz stuff, and yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
If we go to the next step, which is that of social spending, taxes, healthcare, that type of thing, I think individually on the issues, time after time, we see that if people are asked fairly, not in push polling, not by Frank Luntz, but in a real way, do you believe the government should provide a basic level of healthcare to everybody simply for being a member of that society? 2/3 or more, time after time, say yes, right? When you start mushing it in with all of the Fox News style framing of the government controlled plan, the so-called public option and all of that, all of a sudden support goes way down. So yeah, I'm optimistic that if you actually get cohesive, progressive organizing around framing, you can actually make a big difference. The thing is, it's just so boring to talk about for so many people. They say, yeah, I get it, but I don't really want to organize around words.
Well, I'm a geek. I love framing in words, and I think they're incredibly important.
I understand. I understand you do, but it's hard to make
Sure.
that appealing broadly. You know?
Sure. No, absolutely. But I think that I wanted to kind of, because I think in some ways though you can argue that Obama's campaign was great at that. They did a much better job of creating a cohesive alternative narrative, and there was a lot of energy around framing after Bush was reelected. And now we've kind of gotten to this next step of, as I was kind of mentioning earlier, like you can activate people for campaign work, but maybe people want to actually have some more say in a substantive agenda. And I think related to that, maybe that type of Republican framing is more easy to do when we're still riding a tech bubble or a real estate bubble, or the kind of wedge between people on the middle class, but you can basically go to a good college and get a job. You can basically put the flat screen on your credit card and it's okay. That's getting thinner and thinner.
It is.
And does that make that framing, it's like watching Entourage, maybe in 2003 or 2004, you're like, oh, this is really awesome. I want to go to LA and have this fun lifestyle. And then maybe in 2009, when you watch the season premiere of Entourage, you're like, huh, this is a little slightly obnoxiously disconnected, if that makes sense.
I think it is. And I hate to mention something that actually Republicans mention all the time, but people are increasingly bored with the Oscars, for example, right? I don't think it's a surprise that the ratings for the Oscars go down every year. And I'm not Bill O'Reilly saying people are sick of elitists per se, and that the politics of the actors are the reason. But I do think that people are increasingly concerned with real issues affecting them, and that people showing up in limos to the Oscars, and I know I almost sound like a conservative saying it. I almost sound like Bill O'Reilly saying it. But I've stopped caring about that. I used to be interested in that. I just don't care anymore. Maybe it's because I'm older now, but I don't think so, because my parents also were interested in watching that 10 years ago, and now they don't care either.
Right. And
they were always older than I am. So I think it is becoming thinner and thinner. That's just one kind of anecdotal example. But yes, I totally agree with that.
Yeah. Yeah, well, it's been great talking with you, David.